The 7th of August, 1942, above Guadalcanal, Petty Officer First Class Saburō Sakai banked his Mitsubishi A6M0 toward 8 Enterprise SBD Dauntlesses below him. Tropical light flashed across the canopy. Green coastline and the American landing area lay beneath the formation as the Zero's engine shuddered through Sakai's seat. He saw slow American aircraft and read them as fighters. Sakai committed to the attack with the certainty of a Tainan Air Group ace credited with 64 victories. China, the Philippines, and New Guinea had taught his group that speed, turning, and experience could settle a sky before an enemy understood the danger. Now he drove down toward the 8 machines in close formation. They held their course beneath him, and Sakai expected the familiar advantage to be waiting in his hands. That certainty had already met an American force Sakai had judged by the wrong measure. U.S. Navy aircrew training had put Enterprise crews over Guadalcanal prepared for a task he had discounted. By 1945, Sakai would still be alive, permanently damaged by the attack that began above those 8 aircraft. The wound would remove him from the sortie as the 64 victory veteran who had entered it. It would leave permanent damage to one eye. The immediate cause remained inside the formation below him, where American crews carried a discipline Sakai had not granted them. Enterprise had sent its SBD Dauntless crews toward a contested island on the morning American forces came ashore. The carrier's air group was part of a larger naval presence now committed to Guadalcanal. Its dive bombers were not the fast fighters Sakai believed he had found, yet from his cockpit, their shape and speed appeared to confirm everything his experience had taught him. On the Japanese side, the Tainan Air Group brought men whose combat habits had been sharpened across the Pacific's expanding front. They came to Guadalcanal with the confidence of veterans who had survived earlier campaigns and expected their Zeros to retain the initiative. Their machines still climbed. Their formations still crossed long stretches of ocean. Their pilots still believed that skill, drilled over years and tested in combat, could impose the old terms on any American force that entered their airspace. Guadalcanal made those assumptions costly because the island was not an empty target. American landing forces had opened a struggle for the air above the island, and Japanese naval aviators were answering from their forward bases. Every flight carried more than aircraft into that sky. It carried the standing of a veteran cadre that Japan could not casually replace. Sakai's attack therefore mattered beyond one cockpit. He was not a novice learning a hard lesson in his first action. He was a man whose judgment had been rewarded repeatedly, flying with a group whose reputation rested on the conviction that its experienced pilots could see danger first and strike first. Later, Sakai acknowledged that he had mistaken the American aircraft before he attacked. 8 Enterprise SBD Dauntlesses stayed in his view. The formation he entered had been judged before Sakai had reached it. On the 7th of August, 1942, Enterprise crews were still flying toward Guadalcanal while Sakai's Zero turned above the island. The morning was bright, the sea hard beneath the horizon, and the landing area below had become the center of a new fight before either side could measure its full cost. The Japanese response came from a world built around elite airmen and the faith placed in them. Tainan Air Group pilots had been sent across immense distances to meet the American landing. Their experience was a weapon they carried personally, in judgment, reflex, formation discipline, and the confidence to press an attack that less seasoned men might avoid. Sakai had no reason, in that instant, to treat the slow aircraft beneath him as equals. He closed in the way a veteran closes when the target seems to have offered him its weakest angle. The Zero answered his controls. The formation grew larger in the canopy. Below, the American dive bombers kept moving toward their mission. The island itself offered no comfort. Guadalcanal was a narrow strip of green surrounded by water, with American forces ashore and Japanese naval aviation forced to answer the landing across open sea. Men in the Japanese force were still thinking in the language of attack. They had arrived to contest the air, not to surrender it. That was the pressure carried into Sakai's dive. His experience had made quick decisions feel reliable. Earlier victories had taught him to trust the first read of an enemy aircraft, the first opening in a formation, the first instant when surprise belonged to him. He acted before doubt could slow the attack. The Enterprise crews remained ahead of him. Their destination was the contested island. Sakai's destination was the formation. The Japanese aviators pressed toward Guadalcanal, believing their veterans still held the sky. 8 aircraft waited beneath the Zero, and the habits that had made Sakai dangerous were already carrying him toward their test. Behind that confidence stood the small cadre that had made the Tainan Air Group what it was. On the 1st of October 1941, at Tainan in Taiwan, the Imperial Japanese Navy formed the Tainan Air Group around a small body of naval aviators already shaped by years of demanding flying and combat discipline. Its fighter pilots were taught to attack first, hold formation, and trust the man nearest them. Their weapon was the Mitsubishi A6M0, built for distance, climbing power, and violent turns. The group was not an abstraction on a staff chart. Ground crews dispersed aircraft across Tainan Airfield. Armorers loaded cannon ammunition. Mechanics worked beneath open engine cowls, while pilots studied routes over water that could leave no room for hesitation. Every aircraft carried the value of the man who flew it, because the group's strength rested in a limited cadre whose experience had taken years to create. That cadre moved into the Pacific War, with habits already tested in China, the Philippines, and New Guinea. Sakai served in the New Guinea campaign with the Tainan Air Group, where the Zero's long reach let Japanese fighters arrive over distant targets with fuel and aggression still available for the fight. Tight formations gave veterans the confidence to turn together, strike together, and withdraw before a less experienced opponent could recover. The doctrine rewarded quick judgment. A pilot who recognized an enemy machine first could choose the altitude, the angle, and the moment of attack. In the Japanese naval service, that judgment was treated as a personal weapon, earned through long preparation and preserved through survival. Sakai had survived enough combat to believe the first look at an aircraft could tell him what kind of fight it would become. The Tainan Air Group gave that belief an institution behind it. It had aircraft, crews, commanders, and a reputation carried from base to base across the southern Pacific. Sakai could speak with the calm of a man who had seen the method work. We were taught to take the initiative. It had been formed on the 1st of October 1941. On the 6th of August 1942, at Rabaul on New Britain, Tainan Air Group aircraft stood at a forward base from which Japanese naval aviation could answer the American landing at Guadalcanal. The distance was part of the calculation. An A6M0 could fly about 930 miles, carrying Japanese veterans across expanses of sea that would have denied shorter-range fighters the same reach. Rabaul gave the old doctrine a new runway. Pilots prepared for combat with the same assumptions that had carried them through earlier campaigns. The Zero remained light, agile, and heavily armed for its size. Its wings carried 2 20mm cannon. Its cowl held 2 7.7mm machine guns. In the hands of a practiced pilot, those weapons made a brief firing pass enough to decide an encounter. The men at Rabaul did not see their experience as a fading advantage. They saw it as proof. Their formation discipline had survived long flights, tropical weather, and combat over distant islands. Their aircraft could still cover the water between New Britain and Guadalcanal. Their veterans still expected to arrive over a battlefield before American crews understood the danger. The American naval presence was already moving under them and beyond them. It brought more crews into the fight, more aircraft over the island, and more tasks for Japanese aviators to meet. From Rabaul, those effects looked like the normal friction of a new campaign. They did not yet look like a challenge to the judgment that had made the Tainan Air Group feared. Sakai's confidence was therefore not carelessness. It was the product of a doctrine that had delivered results whenever his Zero found the first opening. He had learned to read a formation, identify its weak side, and turn a moment of surprise into an attack before the target could change its shape. Sakai could still say, the Zero was made for this distance. Its range was about 930 miles. On the 7th of August, 1942, above Guadalcanal, Sakai found that a formation could present a different arithmetic from the one he expected. He attacked one apparent opening. Behind the dive bombers, the rear stations carried paired guns. The formation placed 16 rear gun barrels behind aircraft he had treated as vulnerable targets. The count did not match the judgment. One attacking Zero met 16 defensive barrels. On the 6th of August 1942, at Rabaul, the Tainan Air Group had prepared to carry its fighter force toward the new battle. Its consequence was immediate and countable. Japanese naval aviation committed one fighter organization to the Guadalcanal response, and its veterans flew from a base on New Britain rather than waiting for the Americans to come closer. On the 7th of August 1942, above Guadalcanal, Sakai made a second adjustment of his own. Observation ended. He committed 1-0 into the formation he had selected. The consequence was equally concrete. A fighter pilot who had expected an easy attack now entered a defensive field, created by the aircraft behind him, not by the American machines he had first imagined. Neither decision came from fear. Rabaul sent experienced aviators forward because their aircraft still had the range to reach the island. Sakai attacked because his combat habits still told him that initiative belonged to the man who recognized the target first. The Japanese response was motion, not retreat. It put aircraft over Guadalcanal and placed a veteran pilot where the formation's rear stations could answer. Sakai had trusted his first judgment enough to press the attack. I saw an opening and went in. 1-0 had entered a field of 16 guns. The aircraft behind the formation had not yet shown Sakai why his count would not close. On the 7th of December, 1941, at Naval Air Station Pensacola in Florida, American naval aviation was already turning training into a routine that could be repeated. Student pilots worked through ground instruction, flight drills, navigation, gunnery, carrier preparation, and the discipline of operating beside another crewman. Aircraft returned to the line. Instructors sent another class into the air. That system did not give every American crew Sakai's combat record. It gave them assigned tasks that did not depend on one veteran's instinct. An SBD pilot held formation, watched the leader, and carried the aircraft toward its mission. His rear gunner watched the sky behind. The pair did not need to win an individual contest. They needed to keep the aircraft stable long enough for both stations to work. At Naval Air Station Corpus Christi in Texas, the same process moved naval aviators through flight training before fleet assignment. A man could leave the training field for a carrier air group with his place in a crew already defined. That was the capacity Japanese naval aviation lacked when experienced men disappeared from a unit. The loss was not only a pilot, it was the time required to make his judgment dependable under fire. Enterprise carried that difference over Guadalcanal. Its SBD crews had been trained to fly as pilot and gunner teams, and the defensive formation made Sakai's chosen attack angle costly. He lost the freedom to approach without being watched. He lost the safety of judging each dive bomber as an isolated target. His dive placed him where the rear stations could act together. The subtraction was immediate. Sakai could still fly a 0. He could still use the experience that had brought him into the formation. But his veteran judgment had sent him into a position where training at the back of American aircraft mattered as much as skill at the controls of his own. For Japan, that was a procedural danger. A veteran could be wounded in seconds. A replacement crew could be moving to Pensacola or Corpus Christi before the next fleet assignment opened. American naval aviation had 10 923 pilots when the war began. The Tainan Air Group faced crews trained to hold their work together. 10 923 pilots formed the American naval aviation base that would keep supplying fleet units. The problem was no longer the guns behind one formation. It was the system that kept putting trained crews into those stations. At Naval Air Station Corpus Christi, Texas, the American answer to Sakai's miscalculation was built into the sequence before a fleet crew ever reached a carrier. Ground school gave pilots procedures. Flight instruction made those procedures physical. Gunnery and navigation assigned responsibility to men who would later fly in pairs and formations. Carrier training added another standard because a naval aviator had to leave and return to a moving ship. That is why the defensive count Sakai encountered did not close in his favor. The rear stations were not an accidental addition to slow dive bombers. They belonged to crews trained to keep formation, maintain fields of fire, and continue a mission while another man watched the approach. The formation's defense was repeatable because the crews had been prepared for the same task before combat found them. Japan could alter an attack route, change altitude, or send its experienced fighters farther from Rabaul. None of those adjustments created another long-established training pipeline. The Tainan Air Group could concentrate its best men, but concentration made each wound more expensive. It could send veterans forward, but every forward sortie spent the small cadre on which the unit's reputation rested. The American system imposed a different arithmetic. A fleet air group lost men and aircraft, then received trained replacements whose duties had already been taught at shore establishments. The enemy could damage an American crew. He could not make the training sequence disappear. By the end of the war, the Navy had trained 658 pilots. Japanese naval aviators understood the danger in practice before they could solve it in doctrine. The fighter force still depended on pilots, whose advantage came from accumulated experience. The United States increasingly depended on a process that preserved a crew's tasks even when the individual crew changed. That did not make every American crew invulnerable. It made Japan's margin temporary. At Guadalcanal, Sakai's attack showed the cost of treating discipline as a lesser quality than veteran instinct. His approach did not break the formation, it exposed him to the men he had discounted. The wound that followed would not be a failure of courage or a failure to press home an attack. It would be the result of a veteran entering a defense built to function under attack. Japanese naval aviation could still send skilled pilots into combat. 658 trained Navy pilots marked the scale of the American pipeline. Sakai Zero was already closing on the formation that would turn that difference into a wound. The approach remained procedural. Sakai came down behind the Enterprise dive bombers, expecting their shape and speed to give him the advantage. His Zero carried him into firing position. The SBDs did not scatter. Their pilots kept the formation moving over Guadalcanal while the men in the rear stations watched the direction from which the Japanese fighter came. Sakai had committed himself before the danger became visible. The attack demanded a close pass. He had to hold his line long enough to fire. That put the Zero inside the defensive field of the formation, where the rear gunners could see him as a target instead of as an unseen attacker. The veteran had lost the space needed to choose the terms of the encounter. Then the guns answered. A .30 caliber bullet struck Sakai in the head. The impact shattered the confidence with which he had entered the dive. Blood filled his face. His vision failed on one side. The cockpit that had carried a seasoned fighter pilot toward an easy attack became a place where he had to keep the aircraft under control long enough to get home. The reversal came after the formation had already done its work.